Hefsi, it's so great to see you again after we worked together in Machon Mandel, Manigut Chinuchit. And you certainly, with your career, have exemplified what our vision was. Kol hakavod. Isn't it wonderful to meet your old students many years later? It really is. It's a... All right, Ainli Tshuvot. But in place of answers, I have stories to tell. And the nice thing about stories is they create opportunities for you to participate in the story and generate some of your own Tshuvot. I became again aware this morning of how persistent the stereotypes in our society are, even after the mitziyut on which the stories were based, or the stereotypes were based, no longer exist. And I'm thinking now of the movie that was shown in which almost all of the kids talking about their excitement over science and math were women. So I, a couple hours ago, went looking for the bathrooms. This is a daily task that we don't have at home, but we do when we're in a new place. And I'm confronted with two doors. The two doors have different symbols. One has a figure with a triangle pointing down. The other has a symbol with a triangle pointing up. I actually began going into the wrong door. And I thought to myself, those symbols are supposed to be iconically unambiguous, like a stop sign. You see the same kind of stop sign whether you're driving in Colorado or Kazakhstan. And yet, I had to think about why the symbol for a woman showed what was supposed to be a skirt, a dress. I came back in this room and I began looking around. Tistaklu. Of all the women participating here, I saw 3 dresses. But notice, the stereotype persists even when the reality is different. And this is the beginning of an explanation for why it is such a challenge for us to overcome those stereotypes. I was teaching, and by the way, in all of my years in higher education, every single year, but all my years were in research universities, every single year I taught teachers. Every single year. I felt it was both an obligation and a privilege. Whether at Michigan State University, that prepared more than 2,000 teachers a year, and it's a research university, or at Stanford, where we prepared maybe 80 teachers a year. My first year teaching at Stanford, I'd been teaching at Michigan State for 19 years already. I taught a class on the principles of learning for teaching. And I wanted to illustrate the principle that the right kind of teaching can take very complex ideas and make them accessible even to young children. That there's something magically intelligent and skillful about teaching. And I had learned from reading the work of a very famous American psychologist who had become a friend of mine, Jerome Bruner. I don't know if that's a name you've heard, alav shalom. And he showed from the experience how to teach quadratic equations, the concept of quadratic equations, to kids in Kita Gimel or Kita Dalet. Now, quadratic equations are considered a serious mathematical concept. And the way they did it was to skip the algebraic representation and represent quadratics graphically with pictures. And the kids learned it, and learned it well. And I gave this explanation, and then it was a 2-hour class. We broke after the first hour, and a young man came up to me, and he said, Lee, we use first names at Stanford. Lee, I want to introduce myself. Gave me his name. He said, I have a master's degree in engineering from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. That's it. Almost as good as the Technion. But I decided I would find more fulfillment teaching mathematics than doing engineering. Now, if you had given me a problem in quadratic equations, I could have solved it in my sleep. I know the skills. I know how to manipulate these ideas. Lee, this is the first time in my life I understand the quadratic formula. And I have to say, that was one of those triggering experiences that stimulated the development of an idea that I'm fairly associated with now of pedagogical content knowledge. He had the content knowledge. He didn't understand how to transform what he knew, not only into something students would understand, but something he could understand. It's then that I began to recognize that teachers have to understand their content more deeply than ordinary mathematicians or physicists. Aristotle in his Metaphysics said, it's one thing to understand the sciences and the arts, but only people who can understand them most deeply can teach what they know to somebody else. And this is why the preparation of teachers must have an equal place in universities, in our teacher training colleges. This is tough stuff. I'll tell one more story. We'll leave for later, Morimo Vilim. John gave my spirits a lift earlier today. In the course of his lovely articulation of ideas, he used the phrase, tinkering towards utopia. Must be very tinkering. Ma? You know, when you're not exactly know how to fix something, you tinker with it, you know, you play with it, sort of. All right, we'll discuss that at lunch. But the point is, Larry Cuban is his name, and David Tyack, another historian at Stanford, and in fact, Cuban was Tyack's student originally, wrote this book on the history of American education and described attempts to improve American education as tinkering, messing around essentially, with eventually the goal of utopia. Olam haba, achrit hayamim. I'm not trying to say this, probably in Hebrew it's utopia. Well, Larry Cuban and I but first of all, you know, here's this, I think you would call Larry a rather well-known historian of education. Both of us taught in the teacher education program. Teaching teachers, future teachers, was not something that was relegated to junior people. It was so important, the full professors had to do it. And one year, Larry and I were scheduled to teach a graduate course on teaching. I from the perspective of the psychology of education, he from the perspective of the history of education, and both of us dealing with issues of practice. Now these are graduate students. And we decided to do something revolutionary. For 6 months of that year, every morning at 8 a.m., we were in a local high school. One of our former students was responsible for the first period class in American history, and we persuaded her that if we took that responsibility, the damage we would do to the students would not be eternal. So here are students, probably half of them black students, African American students, another third Mexican American. You know, it was a very diverse classroom, kids coming from generally poor areas, and we're teaching them American history beginning with the American Civil War. I have to tell you that I think they looked at us and thought we were giving first-person accounts. Which battle did you fight in? But the beauty of it was, we taught together for an hour in the morning. Then we had the luxury of half an hour sitting in the same school in a quieter place and debriefing. It was so important. A luxury that most teachers don't have. To actually build into their day an opportunity to reflect critically on what they've just done. What a luxury. And then we went to the university. I drove. Larry Cuban rode his bike. And an hour and a half later, we're teaching our graduate course together. And we're able to draw examples from what we did that morning. And then in the afternoon, Larry was a historian. So he went back into the quiet of his office and did some history. Probably tinkering toward utopia. I'm a psychologist. I had a big research group. 5, 6, 7 PhD students, full-time at Stanford with me. And we're doing research. But the beauty of it was for me that that research was done in the context of teacher preparation. It wasn't done in a different institution. And in fact, the research we were doing was research on how do teachers learn to teach, what kind of knowledge is unique for teachers, etc. We couldn't have done it if we were somewhere else. This integration of theory and practice, I believe, is extremely important. Now, one of those students who was with me during those years has since caused a great deal of difficulty for universities in Israel. His name is Sam Weinberg, and he led a committee that created Doch Weinberg, which was a scathing criticism of teacher education in universities, and in part because they weren't really places for practice. So I end these comments by simply saying that we were able to get away with a lot of the mischief we got away with, and I apologize if our colleague from Malag is still here, because we don't have a Malag. We don't have a higher education authority. From the perspective of Israel, American higher education looks like something hefker. It's chaos. But it means that we're more free to experiment, to make mistakes, see our mistakes and correct them, or sometimes just continue them, but that's another matter. So those are my stories, and I think there may be some lessons hidden in them about some paths to excellence, but I leave you to derive the principles.
Thank you.